We've got four distinguished gentlemen who are going to address us in a panel, one by one. The first gentleman is somebody that I have a special affection for. His name is Doug Busbee, and he has made all the difference in the world in communicating the concerns that Friends of the Edisto has about the difficult challenges that the river faces. In addition to that, Doug is a very busy man, and he promised his wife that if he would get out of this meeting as a condition of agreeing to come and speak, if we would let him go by about this time in about 15 minutes. So I made her that promise, and as much as I am afraid of you, I'm afraid of her more. So we don't want to disappoint her at all. So we're going to hear initially from Doug Busbee. We'll have an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you like, and as long as he'll stay with you. Followed up by somebody who is very special to me, my successor in the South Carolina General Assembly, Representative James Smith. James, in addition to being a formidable force in the legislature and being the lead author of the legislation that would provide some much needed additional support, regulatory support for the Edisto. James is also a well-known, highly respected member of the bar in South Carolina, and is intimately familiar, although he did not participate directly in the Jowers versus Jowers lawsuit, which was just adjudicated by the South Carolina Supreme Court, James, 3 weeks ago. And he can explain in a technical manner where procedurally the case is, what will happen next procedurally, and he can also answer your questions about the position on most of the issues that were reflected in the plaintiff's part of that case. Once again, he's kindly agreed to stay and answer questions that you may have. The same also for Bruce Campbell, who is a hydrologist with the USGS in South Carolina. Very familiar with the Edisto and the hydrological factors that make up the river. He can answer questions that you may have in that regard, and I know that there are several of you who are technically oriented a lot more so than myself here who would be eager to talk to him. And finally, David Baize, a senior staff member at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, and someone who is directly involved in the capacity use expansion over the proposed expansion over some 7 counties in South Carolina. a major initiative on DHEC's standpoint, and why and how that process is unfolding is something that he can talk about for a long time, and has graciously agreed to come down and share his time with us, answering questions about capacity use expansion, what it means, where it is now, and what the likely outcome may be. So with that brief introduction, I want to turn it over to my good friend, Doug Busbee.
It's good to see everybody. I am not a politician. I'm not a scientist. I have very few credentials behind my name other than being a junk man and other than being born and raised in the headwaters of the South Edisto River. And I was trying to think 4 years ago, we heard of a giant farm that was coming, and my uncles and my cousins were some of the first ones to speak out about it and brought it to my attention. And they all farm. And it's not that we were against the farmers, but we got to wondering how this giant farm was going to exist on this small river, which is, I can literally put a 14-foot John boat across this river in places, and it touched both sides of the riverbank. So we got to questioning what was going on, what is happening, what has happened that we didn't know anything about. And in 2010, there came to be a law that we knew nothing about, and until 2013, early 2013, we started discovering what was going on, and we came to understand that it had a formula in it called a safe yield formula, which I believe is at the crutch of the problem. And this safe yield formula we've seen at times of the year in the summer months, for 7 months out of the year, this safe yield formula, or legally available amount of water that this formula promises, be greater than the actual flow of the river. And we've seen it be as much as 5 to 6 times the flow of this river. And last August, I was telling Mr. James, last August, one of the hydrologists from DNR was here, was standing in this very place. And the intake for the Charleston Water Department is just up the river about a quarter of a mile. And he made this statement to me. He said, Doug, I looked at the gauge today, at the flow gauge right here at the bridge at Givhans Ferry, and he says, if Charleston needed their permitted amount, in other words, the amount that they could withdraw, there's not enough flow in the river to supply their permitted amount for the city of Charleston. Now, this year we've had plenty of water, but we must plan. We must plan for the future. And we've got a law right now that promises many times the flow of the rivers. Every river and stream in the state has a safe yield amount in it, which is an amount that can be legally allocated. And it creates a problem when the safe yield amount is greater than the flow. And I get asked all the time, Doug, what can I do? And I tell people, know your legislature, know your senator. Let them, when they see your number come up, they should know that number. They should know that number. My legislator, he does not like to see my number come up, because he knows I'm going to talk to him about that river. And I would encourage you to stand up, know your legislature, know your senator, speak to them about it. This is a fact. This safe yield formula is a problem, and it's not just about agriculture. This same safe yield formula promises water that we don't have to industry and to power companies. So it's a large picture. We've got a lot of opposition, but it's not fair to a farmer. It's not fair to an industry, or anybody that, a user, it's not fair to you as anyone that uses the river. It's not fair to promise water that's not there for 7 months of the year. And this has been my whole point the whole time. I'm not against farming by no means. I'm not against the industry. We've all got to have a place to work. But I am against a formula and a law that promises more water than we have. And it's not fair. And I would encourage you, again, I'm not a politician. My only credentials was that I grew up in the river swamp, and I know it. My daddy's theory about growing up, we had 3 boys, and my daddy's theory was that I was way better off in the swamps with the moccasins in the swamps than I was with the moccasins on the streets. So I spent a lot of time hunting and fishing, and I've seen changes in the river. But I would encourage you, if you care about South Carolina as you know it, speak up. Speak to your senators and legislatures, and I would encourage you. I'm nothing more than a citizen. I'm one of you. But I made a choice to speak up. Now, it's scary. It's scary sometimes to stand up in front of a crowd and say, oh, you know, they not going to think, well, I had to get over it. Somebody had to stand up. And I would encourage you to speak out, speak to your friends, your neighbors, because it's real. And it starts with a grassroots group. It starts at your county council, your locals, your local county councils. Get them to pass some ordinances. It starts, and believe me, these politicians listen to the county councils. When they see that county council start moving, then they take note. So I would encourage you to work on your local legislator, work on your county council person, work on anybody that'll listen. But it's a real problem. And just because we lost this lawsuit, they lost because nobody had harm yet. It's inevitable. This disaster, this train wreck will happen, and it will happen. You can't get by with promising more than you have. Especially when we've seen examples of it down on the lower rivers, in the Black River and Manning and some of the others, the safe yield be 70 and 80 times the actual flow. And that's a crazy law. And when I first started, I said, surely this is a misprint, a mistake, a mathematical mistake. I said, surely it's a mathematical mistake and it'll get corrected. You know, we'll make a few phone calls and we'll get it corrected. I'm 4 years, better than 4 years now fighting. And I don't know that we're any closer than when we started. We've made a lot of noise, but I don't know that we're any closer than when we started. But I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. I can promise you that. I appreciate y'all letting me come. And Tim, if it's all right, we'll let everybody introduce themselves and then do the questions, because I got a little bit of a reprieve from my wife. I can stay a little while.
You go ahead and open up.
I'm gonna bring you. You want to open questions? Any questions for me? I'll be available for a little while. Any questions, y'all? Again, thank you. I would encourage you to know your legislator, know your senator, get to know them, ride over and see them, get to know them. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, very much. And Doug does what I think we all should do, which is not just know who your legislator is, who your House member, who your senator is, but make sure they know who you are. Just like Doug said, when he calls, they know exactly who he is and why he's calling, and he's exercising his rights in our great democracy to be heard and to move our state in the right direction, to protect those things that matter most to us, which is this beautiful state we live in and the natural resources we have here, and we want them to continue. So thank you for what you're doing every day, and it's been a privilege to stand with you and with all of you here to continue this effort and make sure, and we will be successful one day. I'm absolutely confident our efforts will prevail. It's a question of, do they prevail now when it makes common sense to do so, or do we wait till an absolute, total crisis and the state is finally forced to act? Our view is we ought to do the right thing now, and so I want to thank my dear friend and mentor, Tim Rogers. Tim mentored me for many years. I mean, 6 years working with him before I was able to succeed him. He taught me a lot of good lessons. One was the night of my first election. I couldn't believe it. I'm 27 years old. I'd just been elected to the House. We're at the Capitol Cafe on Main Street, about 11:30. Lee Bandy's there, at the, having something there. Good, talk to good old Lee Bandy, and I start writing on a napkin this list, and started writing. We were talking. As a matter of fact, Tim pulled out of his wallet and handed me his block building key that evening, and I was very excited. Couldn't believe it. And he finally looks at me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I just got elected to the South Carolina House. These are all the great ideas I'm going to take, to the State House." And he started shaking his head, and he said, "Smith, didn't I teach you anything? Don't you know the legislature's no place for great ideas?" And he's right. Ideas by themselves, no matter how great they are, don't go anywhere without people who care about it, who are willing to stand up and fight for it and make a difference. A great idea will sit there and go nowhere unless people are willing to act and move and urge their members to respond and vote correctly. And I've seen it happen, and it does work. The legislature made a mistake in 2010 when we passed the Surface Water Act and provided this gaping hole of an exemption for agricultural uses. Many of us thought we were doing the right thing. Average farmer wouldn't be using that 3 million gallons per month. This was going to be something that made perfect sense. All the conservation groups, everybody would seem together on the same page. We were not prepared for what obviously happened. We were not prepared for the Walthers of the world to come in and basically take the equivalent of a coal-fired power plant. And it seems perfect common sense. If you're going to take the kind of resource, water, and you're going to, in this case, even with a power plant, they just put the water back in the river. This goes on the ground, and a very small percentage of it ever makes it back into the river. So it's a greater impact, really, in some respects, than some of these large power plants. So it's very good common sense to say there ought to be a permitting process. There ought to be a process of establishing what is reasonable. And so we're working to do that on one hand at the State House, and the bill that I've introduced is pending to do that. On the other hand, there's been legal action taken, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that, as Tim mentioned. It's the Jowers versus SC DHEC case. The decision came down, was filed July 19th, just a few weeks ago. Pending currently is a motion or a petition for rehearing, and it basically is a long list of bases where they want to go back in and urge the court to reconsider the decision it made. And I'll tell you, although it's a 3-2 loss, I mean, the plaintiffs in the case actually, lost what they were trying to do, but it isn't a total loss, because what the court said is you can bring all these causes of action. They are very valid causes of action, but they're just not right. We might disagree on that, and I'll go through and tell you where I think hopefully we might prevail in the rehearing, because we're this close. We're this close, particularly on one of the more important causes of action. But let me tell you a little bit about the case. The case basically brought several causes of action. One was the plaintiffs were saying there was an unconstitutional taking, that this act took away property rights. In this case, riparian rights, rights to the water. That anybody who borders the river has an interest, a common law interest, and a right to that resource. And what the plaintiffs were saying is that this act took that away without any just due process, without even a notice, because as you know, this registration process, it can be done in silence. You're not going to get an opportunity for a hearing or to talk about it. It gets done, and you find out about it often when it's too late. Violation of a due process. The way this stuff is done not just takes away your riparian rights, but does it in a way that violates your right to due process, a notice and a time to be heard. And a violation of the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine, the basis says the state holds resources in trust for all of us. Makes perfect sense. A river is just that. The state presides over it, writes laws over it, as this law does, but it must do it in a way that keeps trust with the public and doesn't take their right away and doesn't deny what they hold in public trust for all of us. So what the court said, I'm going to read just from a couple of provisions that I think really sort of surmise. They divided the decision into basically two areas, primarily the taking of the riparian rights and not being able to have due process, and then also the public trust doctrine. Essentially, the court wrote, in summary, the plaintiff's allegations that the Act has deprived them of their common law riparian rights are not supported by the terms of the Act. The plaintiffs may still challenge an agricultural use as unreasonable. They are still entitled to injunctive relief when they prove that the required elements, and that they may still recover damages when they satisfy the applicable standard of proof. What the court was saying, the Act, you still have these rights. But when the plaintiffs brought the case, they didn't allege an actual current injury. They said the Act creates a situation where there will be an injury, and it can define, just as Doug was saying, just as plainly as Doug was saying. He's seen it, and we've all seen it, the times where the safe yield is above what's available in the river. By definition, I think you can see damage in that. The court said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to allow you to bring a case based upon what might happen at a certain particular time. But the court very clearly said, you can bring these causes of action. All these causes of action are very valid under the Act, and they're not prohibited by the Act. But you simply have to have that actual injury to bring it. The court wrote, because the Act has not deprived the plaintiffs of their riparian rights, they have no standing, and their claim for any future injury is not ripe for our determination. Now, for me and many of us, and I do think it is appropriate, but the court obviously disagreed, often you shouldn't have to wait for injury to bring a case if you can define it clearly, and that's what the plaintiffs attempted to do but did not prevail in the court here. The second half of the case, dealing with the Surface Water Withdrawal Act and the public trust doctrine, was also similarly resulted, but the dissent, I think, found the right and resulting decision. But reading from the opinion on the public trust doctrine, the plaintiffs' public trust doctrine claims are based exclusively on their belief that the future surface water withdrawals may endanger assets held in trust by the state, and their argument that the Surface Water Withdrawal Act prohibits the state from protecting those assets. As we have explained, however, the Act provides several mechanisms for DHEC to protect against the loss of trust assets. On its face, therefore, the Act is entirely consistent with the state's obligations under the public trust doctrine. Until a plaintiff alleges the state is failing to utilize its power under the Act or otherwise failing to protect the public trust, any claim based upon the public trust doctrine does not present a justiciable controversy. So what they clearly said is there's a claim to be made, but we have to make it to show and allege that the state is failing to utilize what the protections are, if any, under the Act, or otherwise to protect this resource, and otherwise also allege a current harm, a current concern. The dissent, I thought, which was written by Justice Hearn, she wrote, a very well-reasoned dissent, and she focused on the public trust doctrine, and she used something called the public importance exception as standing. So she said, you know what, some things are so important that we ought not to wait till there's a harm. That the public as a collection, any of us, have such a great interest, there's such importance in the protection of this river that any citizen raising this issue doesn't have to wait till there's a harm in order to have standing to bring this claim. Regrettably, she didn't prevail. She had Justice Beatty concurring in her decision, but it's a close decision. It's a 3-2 decision. It's the kind of thing that could make a difference on a rehearing petition. And I know that's what is under a lot of the efforts being done right now for that petition for rehearing. So key takeaways are, one, the court gave us some good news, and they said that these causes of action do exist. They're there. They're just not right. And I think we have a good shot on the petition for rehearing to maybe get back in and stay in on the public importance exception to bring a claim under the public trust doctrine. So that's where the court case stands. The legislative process, bills are introduced. Obviously, we've had a few things like a $9 billion nuclear plant come to halt, and that's going to occupy and take a lot of oxygen out of the process when we return in January, and we're busy working on dealing with that and responding to that. But this is still going to be high on the list, certainly in my estimation. And I'll tell you, we're having some conversations. And any of those that you have any influence with the Farm Bureau, it'd be nice to see if they looked out for some small farmers, because I can remember, Doug, many occasions when we were holding press conferences, and as far as I can tell, I'm on the side of all the farmers, making sure we had reasonable use of this river. And there was a lot of misinformation about what we were actually trying to do in passing this legislation, and that it wasn't going to cause the damage and fear that they were alleging. And so ultimately, again, I say this, we're going to get this done. I'd like to get it done now when it makes sense to do it rather than later. So both for the court case, why should we wait on a catastrophe and injury? And we'll be making that argument in the courthouse. And certainly in the State House, the same way. These are all very reasonable. They're all it's the same law that's in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. They all have a similar threshold, and they also have a better establishment of what the safe yield is that equates to sort of dealing with the flow of the river, rather than this formula that could end up in taking all the water out of a river. So, but that's my report. It's great to be with you. And does anybody have any questions that I might be able to answer? Yes, sir. Chris? See you.
James, good to see you. I'm wondering with the change with our DHEC director stepping down, if there's been any thought who might step into their place and how that would go for our resources.
Sure. I mean, that's a big question. I'll say Catherine, in many areas, has been just a really strong, very positive leader, advocate. She's certainly restored a lot of morale, I think, at the agency, but really made some very bold decisions and led very strongly. And I look at the Carolina Water Service issue that's in my backyard and spend a lot of time, fighting the pollution that they are regularly dumping in the Congaree and Saluda. So who's next is a really good question. I think we need to be watching that very closely and very carefully, and I think we certainly ought to be letting the governor know the kind of director we want to see. But I can tell you right now, I can't give you a name or somebody who I think that I could say is likely to be the next one to hold that office. But I stay in regular touch with Catherine as she's finishing up her time, and she's really still working to make sure that she leaves the place better than she found it, and I'm sure she has and she will. But as to who's in the future, I don't know. I think the same thing, we ought to look at the board appointees and anybody that needs confirmation in the Senate. We ought to be working to talk to our senators for that confirmation process and making sure the questions we want asked of these appointees are asked and that they satisfactorily respond to those, so that they're not going to they're going to do the right thing for South Carolina. I think that's the way to deal with it. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let me give you a mic.
Thank you. The 3 million gallons a month, how much land could you irrigate with that number?
That's a good question. Somebody who's a farmer probably have to answer that. And that's just surface water combined, you get separate from groundwater. And that's not necessarily a hard line, right? I don't say that's exactly where we need to end up. I say that's where other states have a standard. But I'm saying that there's something between 850 gallons per month and 3. Is it 3? Is it 10? Is it 15? Is it 20 million? There's some point of reasonableness where a permit ought to be sought. And so I don't say it has to be 3. That's where the bill is now, because that's what our other states do. How much would that irrigate? I can't tell you. I'm not a farmer, but I would be interested in seeing, whatever farmers' needs were to be within a reasonable exception that didn't equate to a industrial use, right? So there's an agricultural use that I think has been historically not equal to an industrial or larger commercial use. And there's going to be a threshold there where a permit ought to be required, because what happens there is you're going to make those reasonableness decisions. There's a whole set of criteria about the impact on fish and wildlife, And as you'll know, in other states and in other parts of the country, we're very fortunate and have been, not always, but in terms of the availability of water in our state. But it isn't always going to be that way. And so we all live downstream and upstream from someone else, and we've got to find a reasonable limit, whatever that might be. So I don't know if you the answer to the question, but...
Well, according to Clemson, 3 million gallons a month is enough to irrigate 11 to 12 acres of corn. So would that, anybody over 12 acres be a industrial farm?
No, I wouldn't say that would be an industrial farm if they're over 12 acres, yeah.
So do you think that's a reasonable number to shoot for?
It may not be, but it's a point to start the debate. Yeah, it's a place to begin talking about it. Yeah, I certainly don't think 850 million gallons a month is a reasonable number either.
Whether this river dies by 1,000 cuts or 3 million gallons apiece, or whether it dies by 1 cut, the fact is we got a foreman that promises more river than we got. And I know it's not your fault. You were brought here under that promise. But it's not fair to anybody to come into a situation and be promised water that's not there. Do you agree? If we promised you 850 million gallons and it's not there for 7 months of the year, would you agree that's wrong?
Yeah, I would agree.
It's wrong.
I would agree.
It's wrong. So we need to straighten our law out. Why don't you get with Farm Bureau and help us get it straight so it can be fair to the rest of the farmers downstream?
Look, I think ultimately there is a very common sense position here that at some point, whatever number that is, we are beyond what would be an average, family farm in our state, which I think that was, I'll tell you this, there's no doubt in my mind, having been there, our clear intent was to protect what we thought were the average family farms in our state. We were not here to provide an open door and unfettered access to large industrial farms. That was not what the bill was about. It was never intended to do that, and it shouldn't be doing that. So there is a difference between maybe what you're doing and what you would see in other parts. And there's a different impact and stress on the river, and that's just a fact, and we ought to take for account, and it'll just be good policy to do it, that's all. It's not hard to figure this out. It really isn't. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good to be with everybody today.
Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Campbell with the U.S. Geological Survey, based in Columbia. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Edisto for the invitation to come and participate today. It's a beautiful place. I haven't been to Givhans Ferry State Park in 30 years, I bet, so it's nice to get here again. So, just a little bit about the USGS. We're a federal agency. We're part of the Interior Department. We are the Science Bureau for the Interior Department. Excuse me. We don't enforce any regulations like the EPA does. We don't manage lands like the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service. So our mission is to collect high quality hydrologic data and interpret that data to help decision makers with as they struggle with big problems like this one you're facing here. Personally, I'm involved in a couple of groundwater projects in the Edisto Basin. One focuses on Aiken County, and the other one focuses on the entire South Carolina coastal plain. So we're working at different scales here within the coastal plain, and both give us good information, but we're sort of focused on different aspects of the groundwater situation with the different projects. I guess we're about 2/3 of the way through both of them, so we're starting to get some results and kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel for this work. Certainly, it's not going to answer all the questions. It seems like every time we do one of these big studies, it just brings up more questions that still need to be addressed. But we hope it adds to the understanding and helps with trying to wrestle with these decisions. I know they're not easy decisions, but we hope to bring a science aspect to the decision making process, and hope we can add to that. So and that's our role in this. So we do. I guess all of the gauging on the Edisto, I think we do most of the stream gauging in the state, other than maybe the Savannah, a little bit on the Savannah. So when you check our gauges, you can get the flows and elevations, river elevations, and know if it's a good day to paddle or not. Those are also used for a lot of scientific purposes also, climate change, drought monitoring. In my case, I can calculate the groundwater discharge component of the flows from those gauges, which is a very important aspect of our model calibrations. So there's a lot of good data we collect, a lot of good information we have. Anybody's welcome to get in touch with me. Be glad to ferret out the details that you need. So please don't hesitate. I think Hugo's got my contact information. Anybody needs to get in touch with So just let him know, or you can look. We have a nice web page too, and you can, find me or the information on the web pages also. So I won't. Is that kind of the level of detail?
I think so. I actually have a question if you're to that point on it. Sure. From your perspective, looking at the science and the data, does it make any sense up in Aiken County to deal with groundwater and surface water separately? My understanding is that the river is so connected to the groundwater that really what affects one affects the other.
That's true across most of the upper coastal plain of South Carolina. If you go from Orangeburg north or say Sumter north, the groundwater and surface water is heavily interconnected. Most of the water you see flowing in the streams is discharged groundwater. You have real sandy soils. When the rain falls, very little of it runs across the land surface to the streams. Most of it soaks into the ground. Some is evaporated. Trees use a lot, and the rest is discharged to the streams, and that's your base flow component of the surface water flow. So a little less so as you come down to this part of the coastal plain. Once you drop off what we call the Orangeburg Scarp, that gets a little more disconnected, and there's more of an overland flow component to the stream flow in this part of the coastal plain than the upper part.
If anybody else has questions, I'd love it if you'd use the mic so everybody can hear you. Anybody want to ask something? Let me give it to Bill, and I'll get you coming back.
Bruce, I understand the capacity use initiative from DHEC is based on lowered elevations in groundwater monitoring wells. And you just a moment ago spoke to how you like to look at surface water gauges to assess groundwater flow. With what DHEC has reported in their monitoring wells, have you seen anything correspondingly, any corresponding declines in surface water that would relate to the declines that they see in the monitoring wells?
Well, there's been a marked decrease in stream flow over the last 15, 16 years, really since 2002. Remember the long drought, 98 to 02? And there's a lot of dry years since then. And just about everywhere, when you look at the stream gauge data, with the long-term gauge data, if you plot it up, you'll see these low flow periods. There were some back in the 1930s, some in the 50s, some in the mid 80s, and then we've had the ones since then. And probably this one from starting in 02 has been one of the longer, drier periods that we've seen, and it's a substantial deviation from the normal flows and the normal groundwater levels, where the groundwater levels are affected by direct rainfall. Now, you have the deeper aquifers, like in this part of the state, that really are disconnected from what goes on with the immediate climate. influence, but the shallow wells and the upper coastal plain are affected very, very quickly. So.
So just as a follow-up, I was really curious as to how well it had been documented and maybe reported upon that relationship and those declines. Is it analyzed, is statistically analyzed and reported on in any way?
I think the DNR hydrology division did a report a few years back that documented some of the interactions. I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering that right, but the USGS has not done anything to document that.
Mr. Bruce, I was just wondering, for 2.5, 3 years now, we've been told to wait on sound science. And that seems to be the standard procedure. Is the USGS participating in this study that's being done through the state with CDM Smith? And, is USGS directly involved in the studies?
I don't know a whole lot about it, but the impression I get is not directly, but we provide a lot of the data, especially the streamflow data.
You all are providing the data. Right. And I got you. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. I find myself here just by circumstance, but it's perfect because I live between Givhans State Park and here on the river. And my question and what I'm hearing is a lot about loss of water in the river, but I need help understanding what circumstances have changed that we are flooding so much. Since this potato issue happened, something is being changed, whether it's trees were taken out or they're saturating the groundwater so badly when there is water, it floods down here. But I have your name to contact now. But this is, and might add to what you guys are talking about, harm. Yeah, harm has happened. We are having it in the way of flooding, not because there's not enough water, because the path that it normally would have taken isn't there to be taken anymore. So we have issues.
Well, now there have been two big events in 2015, October 2015 and 16. The Joaquin hurricane, the one that stayed offshore but pumped all the
I was here,
onshore.
I know that,
Yeah.
but
And
we've
then-
also
and then
had, when the rest of the area is not having any flooding,
Yeah.
a minor rain can bring flooding that comes up 5 feet overnight. Now, if there are no dams on this river, what in the world is happening
Well, that's
that
a
I
good
cannot go to
question, yeah.
sleep without having to wake up and decide, do I evacuate or not?
A good question. I don't know the answer, but if you get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with somebody that can give you a much better feel for
I
it.
just want an
So-
answer. I will be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask a question for Bruce? All right, Bruce will be here for the rest of the discussion, so if anything comes up that requires a hydrologist, we got the man for you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, next up will be David Baize with South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. Thank you, David.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation very much to come speak. It's a beautiful place, a beautiful venue, and even though I have been with the department for 29 years now, I've done a variety of jobs. My background actually is in hydrogeology, and I have a bachelor's degree in geology and a master's with a focus in hydrology. And so these issues are near and dear to my heart no matter what positions I've had in the agency over the years. And now I'm actually in a position where I'm really focused on water resources. They're obviously a great topic of conversation here and everywhere across the state. And so right now I'm focusing my efforts on our water resource issues and trying to help deal with them. So one of the efforts I'm going to be talking about today is really on groundwater. So that's what I'm here to talk about today, not surface water so much, but what's going on with groundwater in the state. And most of you probably have not even heard of the capacity use program, but it's been a long-standing program. Really, the law is from the late 70s. And the capacity use program is basically where, over that very same trigger amount, that 3 million gallons in any month, that's about 100,000 gallons a day, about 70 gallons per minute, for those of you who keep up with those fun sorts of facts. So it's a trigger at which are permits required for everyone, including agriculture. So there's no differentiation there on groundwater withdrawals. This is simply if you take out over that amount and you're in a capacity use area, that's the trigger. Well, where are capacity use areas right now? They're currently along the lower coastal plain. It was a little bit as a follow-on to the question that Bruce had about these groundwater interactions. So certainly the shallow aquifers systems do interact with our surface waters, but as you get deeper in the aquifer systems, they form these deep wedges as you head towards the coast. So these deeper aquifer systems are usually confined and don't have surface water interactions, and that's where a lot of the major water supplies come from. So for example, Mount Pleasant withdraws water from the Middendorf aquifer system, and those are very deep wells. So if you can imagine a picture of the coast, really for the PD area, the Waccamaw, then the Trident area, and then the Low Country are all capacity use areas at this time. And so I've been involved with designating several of those. And what really happens under the law is a sort of a demonstration of need. And so it really started with some issues and concerns in Aiken County, but aquifers don't know geopolitical boundaries. So we and DNR looked at groundwater conditions in the coastal plain. The USGS, DNR, and DHEC all partnered together to monitor groundwater levels, and DNR updates these maps every 3 years. So we have a good idea of what's going on underneath the ground. Really, the goal of capacity use permitting and looking at the resource is where we have these areas that are stressed is to come in and add a permitting program so that we can make sure that these groundwater supplies are sustainable. We think the capacity use program has got a good track record. If you look at the Trident area and in Waccamaw, both those aquifer systems there have recovered up to 50 feet because when we started the permitting program and started evaluating groundwater conditions, surface water was brought in for the growth that was in those areas. So, we talk about surface water and groundwater. We do have to think about these things conjunctively, which means we have to balance these uses. Both those resources are there, they're available, and we just have to pick which resource is best for a particular situation and make sure that whatever we do, those resources are sustainable. We don't want anybody locating in a situation where they're not going to have an adequate water supply. So that could go for industry or agriculture or any use. So based on the report, and it's on our website, if you're really wanting to get into the details and look at all the graphs and information, which I won't bore you with today, you'll see the groundwater trends in these areas. So what we've identified is a 7-county area in the western part of the coastal plain. So if you look at essentially Aiken, through Lexington County, down through Barnwell, Bamberg counties, and Calhoun counties. Those 7 counties would potentially comprise the new western capacity use area. So really, again, without boring with a lot of graphs, what we're seeing in these systems is a general trend. So in essence, when we look at these monitoring wells that we have across the state, we're seeing a lowering of groundwater levels, a steady decline over the period of record. And some of them are a little more dramatic than others, but in general, that's the trend. Then what we also see going the other way is the demand chart going up. So when we look at groundwater usage, we're seeing that groundwater usage going up in those 7 counties. So essentially you have what we think are conditions that are right under the law to designate a new capacity use area for those 7 counties. So essentially that means that all those folks that are already registered with us, because everybody in the state, regardless of whether they're in an area that requires a permit or not, reports their water use to us. And we compile that water use information. It's incredibly valuable data. We can tell you how much each water sector uses. We can tell you how much is used in each county. We can tell you all sorts of things with those sets of data. They've also been incredibly valuable in our statewide planning process, because we're in the process of developing statewide surface water models, and then of course the USGS, as Bruce has said, is updating their groundwater model for the entire coastal plain that will be used in the state planning process. So all this water use data is being fed into those models. So in essence, we think that the groundwater conditions are ripe to require permits in those 7 counties. The next steps for us are really holding stakeholder meetings. We've heard from a lot of groups and we've talked with a lot of people. I'm actually out on the road probably 2 or 3 days a week, and have been for the past couple of months and will be for a while, talking to folks and groups like you about this program. The next meeting is actually going to be, we had one in Blackville already a couple of weeks ago. Mr. Busbee, you were at that one. I think he does show up. I will absolutely guarantee you he is a motivated person, and he shows up and contributes to the conversation. So I appreciate you doing that. And the next one is actually scheduled for the 23rd in Orangeburg, and that'll be at the technical school at 6 o'clock. So if you want to see the presentation with all the graphs and stuff, you can come see it then. But we're actually going to go in every county and talk about it with every county. We're talking about it with any group that wants to get together. We're talking with the Council of Governments, because they help implement some of this stuff. So it's a time is right, we think, to go ahead and designate the Western Capacity Use Area. So I'd be glad to take any questions you guys may have.
Thank you for your service to South Carolina, for being here today. You mentioned the threshold use for groundwater in order to require a permit. How much is that?
Yeah, it's the very same trigger level, 3 million gallons a month,
right,
that you mentioned, that's in the surface water law. And you're absolutely right. In other surface water laws and groundwater laws across different states, about that same 100,000 gallons a day trigger is pretty common.
And so, and by having that trigger doesn't mean you're not going to have access to the use of the groundwater or the surface water if you have that threshold. It just allows you all to do some process of determining and sort of taking into account all of the use. Is that right?
Yes, sir. What essentially that trigger does, and you know, states borrow from each other greatly when they're looking at new processes or new pieces of regulation, and so I think that's how these sorts of common triggers, you know, sort of spread through different laws, and that trigger level, to me, sort of separates the home person. You know, you're not going to have a small nursery, home wells, and those come anywhere close to that 100,000 gallons a day trigger, but it does capture people who are pumping larger quantities of water.
David, you said that in the capacity use area we had some success down in the low country over time. With the new capacity use area, with the long-term supply going in one direction, demand going in the other, is there some plan to stall the steady decline, or limit it, or even reverse it in the new capacity use area? What's the thought with DHEC? Sure. What are we going to do about it? Are we just going to continue to watch it, or?
Well, if there's no permit required, then there's really nothing we can do. So permits are things, for better or worse, that are used then to control that dynamic. One of the very first things that would happen immediately after designation would be developing a plan for that area. The other thing I'm out doing right now is, for the existing capacity use areas, is developing local groundwater management plans. And that's what those plans look at. They're really a permitting guide for DHEC to follow. And if there are problem areas that are identified, then we look at those during the renewal cycle. So essentially, those permits are renewed every 5 years. So in year 4, we're going to evaluate groundwater conditions, look at water levels, has a pocket of concern developed that we need to address when we reissue permits, those sorts of things. So that would be the next step.
What's the breakdown by sector? You said that you monitor water use by sector. So what's the use of, say, people, municipalities, agriculture, industry?
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. The one you're probably referencing may be agriculture. Agriculture uses across the board, when you look at groundwater and surface water, about 10% of the water. And when you break down it by groundwater and surface water, agriculture uses much more groundwater than they do surface water. And those statistics really vary greatly even when you break it down into the, say, county region. So I'd mentioned Orangeburg. Orangeburg is a very heavily agricultural area, so their water use is going to be different than Richland County. Richland County gets much more of its water from surface water. We're not seeing those kind of groundwater declines in Richland County, which is why it's not included in this new designation. But those water use statistics can be used to help, understand those water use patterns by different sectors.
So if agriculture is 10% across the board, and we're concerned about the level of aquifers and concerned about safe yield in rivers, would it make more sense to approach the larger users, municipalities or people, the way that we live and consume water, if they're, say, 70%, over going after the smallest user, agriculture? What's being done on that front?
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody's going after anyone. I think all water uses need to be looked at in evaluation, regardless of the sector. And so one of the things I often talk about in the capacity use program, it's really use neutral. Whether you're making tires or you're making baby food, there's no difference. You're either over the trigger or under the trigger. And either the aquifer system can sustain that amount of water that you want or it can't. So we're not making judgments about use. And essentially the same thing goes for surface water. There's no pattern of use that we're providing a beneficial designation over another. Now, water suppliers, we work with them all the time on conservation plans, and part of the planning that's going to go on, I will mention there is a state water planning effort underway now again, and that's going to encompass both surface water and groundwater. It's going to be a statewide process. There's going to be a lot of stakeholder involvement, so I would encourage you to join in that process, because that's going to be an important venue to get your voice heard about whatever particular water sector you represent. If it's recreational use, agriculture, public water supply, everybody will be at the table during that process. And I think if you look at actually public water supply, they've seen a leveling off of their demand in general. So, the lack of growth, the droughts, more efficient water heads, and all those things have come into play to sort of level off water demand for public water supply. But good planning is appropriate for all water use sectors. Everybody can be a winner here. There's no use to pit one particular use against another. We all can find ways to have access to the resource and water we need, regardless of the water sector. We can all be winners. Any other questions?
I actually have one. You mentioned earlier that the 3 million gallon a month figure is not just used in South Carolina, but in a number of states where water policy is an issue. I'm curious, in looking at what other states do, how common or unusual, either way, I don't really know, is the idea of agriculture operating under registration regime where other users are getting permits? Is that something that's done broadly across the nation, or is it something that makes us special?
Every state approaches it a little different. I'm probably most familiar, well, I can give you examples to the north in North Carolina and in Georgia, because I'm most familiar with them because I work with those states a lot. Even though North Carolina has a capacity use program, they haven't really designated too many areas and are not even in the surface water permitting business, so they've just been doing some studies. Georgia, we actually used as, we looked at their water law very closely when our water law was being crafted, and agriculture there is completely exempt. And so they're trying to actually catch up and get those water use figures for agriculture because for whatever reason, Georgia irrigates agricultural crops much more routinely than has been the experience in South Carolina.
Just to follow up, also, you mentioned you were in Blackville, and I was at that meeting as well. I probably saw me there. I am concerned, and I think a number of us are somewhat concerned, that if we make it harder for users to get groundwater, in theory, by raising the capacity use into these counties and making that something that they have to do, it seems like that leaves then surface water exposed to easier exploitation. How are we going to be confident that the connectedness of the river between groundwater and surface water, that if we protect groundwater with capacity use, surface water is not then subject to essentially a run because it's easier to get?
It has been a curious phenomenon, depending on which media I'm there to talk about. If I'm there to talk about surface water, people want to know why we can't use groundwater more, and vice versa when I'm talking about groundwater. So it is very important to keep both media in mind. Both media have to be planned for. They have to be, I think, regulated to make sure that they're all sustainable. That's the goal, whether it's groundwater or surface water. Sometimes groundwater may be your only avenue. If you're, especially an agricultural operation, you're miles away from a surface water body, then, groundwater is probably the only option. In other instances, that may not be your only option, and then you have to evaluate which is the most appropriate. But either way, it's time, really for South Carolina to get serious about planning. And that's why I'm so excited about our state water plan, because, we get 50 inches of rain almost a year. And who would have thought we would have conversations about competition over water? But, if the droughts have taught us anything, we can have water shortages in South Carolina. And the state planning process, I think, is going to be a great vehicle for us to, for the very first time, have models to use to develop basin-specific plans, to have a groundwater model for the first time that can be used to evaluate these different scenarios. So I think we're on the cusp of doing some very exciting things, and things that are first for South Carolina.
I will point out that it doesn't seem like it's stopped raining since we started talking about water quantity issues. I guess that's good for everyone.
I will tell you that I've been on the drought committee for about 15 years, and almost inevitably when we have a meeting of the drought committee, it rains. So it's just.
Would anybody else like to ask a question before we move along? Doug Busbee, on my way.
All right, Doug, I paid you $5 earlier. Take it easy on me. So,
Thank you. I promise it won't be hard.
all right.
And you and I talked about this earlier. I was in a Senate Ag meeting back in April, and CDM Smith, which is the contractor that's doing the modeling, and they stood up and announced that they were essentially through the study. There were some details as to whether they were going to load it on the cloud or load it, but essentially they're through. And my question to you is, when can we expect to be able to use the model? When can we expect DHEC and DNR to draw some conclusions? And also about the same time, some of the DHEC officials said that there was going to be a joint committee formed between DHEC and DNR to discuss safe yield. And has that been formed? If not, when? And my question follows up on Hugo's. If you're promising five times the flow of the river during the summer months, that's not fair to a farmer that's supplying. It's not fair to anyone.
Well, let me
Go ahead.
Let me try and take a shot at it. So and I'm gonna get my $5 back. Those were not easy. So I'll defer again to the state planning process. When the surface water law was drafted, it was about an 8-year process, and it was the biggest group of stakeholders and every sector involved in crafting those, and it was a very contentious, involved discussion at the legislature for many years. So my own personal thoughts are that, again, we're going to have to build consensus and use sound science to try to get to what improvements may be necessary, what we need to do for overall planning, and that, those very same people need to be back at the table because they all had a stake to begin with, and I think they're going to want to have those conversations again. And to your second question, us and DNR, we're certainly we talk all the time. We have met a couple of times already specifically on looking at some of these issues, but there's really been no conclusions formed yet.
So when's the next meeting? I want to come. I want to be there.
I hear you. All right.
Anyone else with a question?
So currently, there's no plans to do anything about safe yield or make any recommendations from DHEC or DNR about safe yield and about changing it? There's nothing coming from them?
I think the agencies are still talking about it, and I just can't commit beyond that we're still talking about it.
All right. In your personal opinion, in your personal opinion, do you think a safe yield formula that promises, and you've seen this as well as I have, promises 5 times the flow of a river is safe?
Well, first of all, I work for the state, so I don't have a personal opinion. So, so we can put that out there. And secondly, we're going to follow the law. We're going to do what the law says to do. So, if the law's changed and we have a new process to implement, that's what we'll do.
Anybody else? That wasn't that bad.
I still want my $5 back.
All right, Tim?
Thank you all for staying and participating and for coming, for your leadership, your enthusiasm, your loyalty to the river, and your support for this organization. My only takeaway that I got from that whole episode is that you do what you have no choice but to do, and that's to keep on working on it. And that's what Friends of the Edisto is going to do. And if you're not involved at this point, come on, we need your help. And if you are, and your next door neighbor isn't, go get him or her, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you all, and we're going to have another hour and a half of bluegrass from Randy.
Actually, they have a gig this evening, probably more like
45 minutes, so you better get out there and enjoy it while you can. And after that, please be careful and safe driving home. Thank you all.